Okay. So this month is Adar Rishon, and Purim and all of those holidays take place in Adar Sheni, the second Adar. And so this month is like a sort of a black, clean slate, in terms of programming and things to teach and talk about. And so I thought we would take advantage of the downtime in the calendar to think about the Shemitah year. So we're heading into about halfway through the Shemitah year this year, which occurs every 7 years. And my experience as an American Jew is that we don't think that much about the Shemitah year in outside of Israel. And when we do, I think we often think about the agricultural aspect of Shemitah, about letting the land rest. And if you would like to hear about that component of Shemitah, Mark and Cindy's son and daughter-in-law, who are farmers in Israel and are actually keeping the Shemitah year without as many of the loopholes as some farmers do, are going to be talking to our kids and anyone else who wants to join on Sunday morning at 9. You'll get a virtual tour of their farm. But I thought that today we could talk about another aspect of Shemitah, which I think is not as well known, and that's Shmittat Kessafim, the release of debt. And before I share the source sheet and we'll dig into the sources, this is appealing to or interesting to me because of the social justice aspect of releasing debt. In this country, we have a huge debt problem. People are taking on more and more debt than ever before. And in like the world of sort of the middle class, debt is like usually not such bad debt, right? When you have a mortgage, that's like good debt. You have your property to secure against the debt. It's usually at a very low interest rate. When we talk about debt forgiveness, we think about forgiving college and graduate school loans when you've worked for a certain number of years in a certain field. But there's also a lot of really bad debt in America, and it's mostly isolated to lower the lower income you are, the higher your bad debt usually is. So credit cards is obviously one of them, right? Credit card interest rates are like 10 times as high as your mortgage rates are. And additionally, the issue of payday loans. So I want to look at the sources on Shemitah, the sort of classical sources, thinking about whether we actually should be keeping Shmittat Kessafim today and why we would do that. And then to think about like how we might apply it to the current state in America. So I will share the source sheet in here.
The Shmittat Kessafim also apply only to Eretz Yisrael?
Great question, which we're going to dig into here, but that's really great. Okay. It's a little bit unclear about whether it should only apply to Israel and whether today, where Shemitah is a biblical command, but it's a little bit unclear when it kicks back in. Right? If you're the type of Jew who believes like Israel is really only a state when Mashiach comes, when we have a Beit HaMikdash, right, then it might not apply today in the same way. Most modern day Zionists have taken Shemitah back on because we do have the state of Israel. We live in the land of Israel again. And so I put this Mishlei source at the top because I think that that's what drives my interest, is that, right, whoever is generous to the poor lends to God. I think that we lose sight often in like our Ben Adam L'Chaveiro mitzvot of that divine aspect of what we do, even when we're doing it person to person, not person to God. And so lending is actually like a holy mitzvah when it's done right. And I think that's a beautiful frame for thinking about it. So, the biblical source, the anchor for Shmittat Kessafim, comes from Devarim Tetvav in the first two psukim, where it says Miket Sheva Shanim Ta'aseh Shmitah, right? You shall have this remission of debts, debt forgiveness, every 7 years at the Shemitah year. V'zeh davar hashmitah shamot kol ba'al maseh yado asher yaseh b're'ehu lo yigosh et re'ehu v'et achiv ki kara shmitah laHashem. Right, every creditor shall remit the due that he claims from his fellow, right? So we say that this only applies to Jews because of Re'ehu. And he shall not dun his fellow or kinsman, for the remission proclaims is of the Lord, right? There is something, I think, certainly divinely inspired about releasing people from debt. And as Charles indicated, there's a debate about whether this applies today and how it would apply. And we'll see the Rambam here and a little bit later. The Rambam is pretty clear that it applies today. everywhere. So we can see here that, right, the Rambam sort of explains how it works. Even a loan in a contract that is lien to properties is surely release. But a field that's being loaned, sort of like an object loan, is not the same. And then we also see in Halacha 9 of his Hilchot Shmitah V'Yovel that one who lends to his fellow in a designated time to repay, that is not released. And we'll see a little bit more of that in the Gemara shortly, right? But I think that this is like a great example of what I love about Jewish law, which is like, how do you balance the values with the practical nature of like living your life, right? So if you're a Jewish mortgage lender, you cannot possibly release all of your mortgages, your 30-year mortgages every 7 years. Like you couldn't work that way, and it wouldn't, society wouldn't really work out that way. And so the Rambam is saying, like, listen, if you have a stipulated number of years, it's 30 years, right? That's when you release it. You don't wait 7. You don't release it after 7 because it's not practical. And so we see in Gittin, we see the case of the prusbul, which is the sort of legal loophole that allows you to hold loans that can't be repaid within 7 years, but also allows you to honor sort of the commitment of the law. And I think that we'll see, right? I think there's 2 ways it could have gone. The halachic sources could have said, just forget about Shmittat Kessafim. It doesn't apply today. It doesn't apply outside the lands of Israel. Just go about your business. Or they could have said, look, this is a really important concept. And we'll see why, I think, a little bit more in a few sources. And so we don't want to just get rid of the whole thing, but we'll create a loophole that allows for it to be used in a practical sort of helpful manner instead of one that causes us to shy away from lending, right? The whole idea is to encourage lending and encourage healthy loan forgiveness when possible without punishing either the lender or the debtor. So in Masechet Gittin, we see that Hillel Hitzkin, so all the way back to Hillel, instituted this document called the prusbul, and the prusbul is it allows the sabbatical year to not abrogate the debt, right? Exactly as I was saying, that there's sort of a need to say. Right, we even see here, right, that it says that he saw that people were not lending to each other close to the Shemitah year. So this is not even about the 30-year mortgage. This is like last year at this time, all of a sudden people were like, I don't really want to loan you money anymore, because they knew that in 6 months' time, they would have to release the rest of the loan. And so it was causing difficulty in the years leading up, right? There weren't as complex loans as 30-year mortgages, but even just the year before Shemitah, that it was causing you not to give, right? And this felt like a direct violation of this pasuk from Devarim, that you don't want to look at your needy brother and give him nothing. Right. So we want to create a system that works, where we feel inclined to give, and also doesn't punish those who need to take out loans. And so I think when I was in high school or maybe middle school, like we did sort of like a mock court of the prusbul, right? So you the essence of the text of the goof of the prusbul is to say that I transfer to you, Charles, the judge, who are in such and such a place in Ann Arbor, that I will collect any debt that I am owed whenever I wish, as the court now has the right to collect the debts, right? And so it just gives you like this legal loophole. So far, how do people feel? Am I going too fast, too slow? I want to cram a lot in 30 minutes.
Maybe you can go a little bit again, just exactly how a prusbul works.
So I will admit I'm not an expert on the prusbul today, but my understanding is that basically, let's say I am going to loan Linda a sum of money, $100, and it's 6 months before the Shemitah year starts. So according to the biblical law, after 6 months, whatever Linda hasn't paid, I will have to just release her from that debt. And so I feel uninclined to lend Linda $100. So the pros bill allows you to sort of put the money almost like an escrow. You assign the debt to the judge, to the court, and the Beit Din doesn't have to release debts because they're not a lender. They're just like the escrow holder. And so then when the Shemitah year starts, I release the debt from Linda, but the court will collect the money for me, and then I can take the money from the court.
Okay.
And so I think that is how it works today, to my understanding, is that like a local Beit Din can sort of assign themselves to be that middleman in the process, if you wanted to uphold Shmittat Kessafim today.
That is on the way here. Old Quest. Yeah. I don't know.
Okay, Mark, do you have a question? I don't want to mute you if you meant to unmute. Okay.
So both the two people involved in the loan would go to the court and agree to them?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so that way, $100, who knows what you might think, but if you were a lender and you lent, someone $100,000 or $1 million to build an apartment complex, right? Then that's like a real thing. You can't expect them to pay it back in 6 months. And again, I think that what I like about the pros bill and what I like about the idea of holding on to fixed point loans, as the Rambam did, is that it acknowledges the benefit of the debt release without forcing it in an impractical way, right? So the pros bill is a workaround. We're saying this is still important to us, and yet we acknowledge that people won't lend money before Shemitah if they won't have any mechanism for getting it back. So this is the mechanism.
But in addition to that, then what you said before is that if the loan said I'm going to pay this money back in 25 years, that doesn't come under the Shemitah anyway.
Correct, according to the Rambam. So it's kind of unfair that I presented them in this order because the Rambam comes several, hundreds of years after the Gemara was written and codified. So the principle was like the first workaround. And the Rambam is saying, well, actually, fixed point loans, they don't even have to be released at that time. It's true. You don't need a pros bill for them. But let's say you lend something sort of in the middle, $600 to someone. You might not make a contract of this many years for $600, but you could assign a pros bill to that so that you wouldn't have to, right? Less than a mortgage, more than spare change. The pros bill is a good middle ground. Okay, excellent. So in the interest of time, I think I want to skip this next piece. This is also from the, this is the basis. So now we're working in the correct order. So this Gittin is the basis for the Rambam's next halacha, this halacha Gimel. So Tanya Rebbe, right? Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi said that the Shemitah, there's two Shemitas. Right? There's two types of abrogation, of release of debt. Medaber achat shmitat karka v'achat shmitat kessafim. Right? So one of the shmitas is the land shmita, as we said, is like the farming one, and one is about debt. And since the two are equated, you could learn the following, right? These are the English helping words. That the time when you release land, you also release the monetary debts. And at a time when you do not release the land, right? Like now, where the Gemara is written in Babylonia, outside the land of Israel, where there is no Shmitat Karka, that then you might think that you also don't have Shmitat Kessafim. So as Charles said, like, is this even still practiced today? The Gemara seems to be leaning towards no, you don't have to. When when we're not in the Shemitah world, then none of the Shmitot apply. But the Rambam jumps in to say, "Umidivrei sofrim," but in the words of the scribes or rabbinic law, "Shetehei shmitat kasafim noheget bezman hazeh b'chol makom," right? That actually we want to practice this release of debt in every place, even though afal pi she'ein hayovel noheg, right? Even though we don't do we don't do this anymore. And what's the reason? Shelo tishkach Torah Shmittat Kessafim miYisrael. Right? The Rambam is holding on to the principle. Not a debt joke. The Rambam is saying, look, maybe midoraita, from a biblical reason, we do not have to practice Shmittat Kessafim, but it's really important. So from a derabanan, from a rabbinic standpoint, Shmittat Kessafim will still stand so that we don't forget that value within the world. And the Shulchan Aruch, as often does, he follows the Rambam, and he is pretty clear. Ein Shmittat Kessafim noheget min haTorah, right? We don't apply Shmittat Kessafim on a Torah level. Ela shebizman shahayovel noheg, right? Only when the yovel is practiced. But umidivrei sofrim, the rabbinic level, as the Rambam said, Shmittat Kessafim noheget bizman hazeh b'chol makom, right? From the Shulchan Aruch's perspective, I think it's pretty straightforward and clear that we should practice from a rabbinic perspective the rules of Shmittat Kessafim today. But then the Ramah, which is the Ashkenazi gloss on the Sephardi Shulchan Aruch, jumps in and he does a really interesting thing. He says that there are those who say, Yesh omrim de'ein shmita noheget bezman hazeh, that we don't have to do it. And that's sort of what we do. Our practice is not to do Shemitah today. And that is... it's normal, right? The Ramah often disagrees with the Shulchan Aruch, but here, like, to me, it feels like the Shulchan Aruch says this beautiful thing. We're going to keep Shmittat Kessafim, and the Ramah says, like, maybe you don't have to. And the Pitrei Tshuva, who's commenting on the Shulchan Aruch on the Ramah, I think he has a really interesting point. He says that the Ramah was melamed zuchut, of the customs of the Jewish people, which basically means no one was practicing Shmittat Kessafim. Shemitah came and went. No one released any debt. No one, no one said that this was what was important. And so the Ramah felt nervous to say you should do it, knowing that no one was actually going to follow through. And that is like more common, although it does not feel full of integrity to me, than I would like to admit happens in the halachic system. And so there's sort of like, I would say, like, right, the Pitrei Tshuva is just saying, like, the Ramah looked the other way. It already had fallen out of practice, and so it's not good. But the Pitrei Tshuva ends with like a pretty strong rebuke, right? He says specifically, the Ramban held that Shmittat Kessafim applies on a Torah level today, right? So the Rambam is saying it's sort of a rabbinic decree, but the Pitrei Tshuva is quoting the Ramban saying that it's actually a d'oraita level, and therefore one who is in awe and fear of the word of God, who would not take the Ramban's words into account, right? Like, how could we possibly worry that we might be violating a mitzvah d'oraita, a biblical command, by not doing Shmittat Kessafim today, right? The Pitrei Tshuva is coming down pretty hard on the Ramah. Like, fine, maybe I understand that culturally or socially this is what had to happen, but it is not cool, right? It's not in the spirit of halacha. So I think that it would be fair to conclude from these sources that practicing Shmittat Kessafim is a good idea. Whether we absolutely have to as Ashkenazi Jews because of the Ramah is, questionable, but it seems very much to be in line with the spirit of, like, what does it mean to move through the world as a Jewish person who lends money? It means that there needs to be some kind of debt forgiveness mechanism that will kick in. And Shmittat Kessafim is that in the Torah. And so time is flying by here. Just want to make sure I'm not taking advantage. I think that here, maybe we'll skip the Ketav HaKabbalah, but to look at Rav Hirsch, maybe we'll look at Rav Kook and Rabbi Sachs to start. And if we have time, we can go back. I think that, right, all four of these commentaries are talking about why Shmittat Kessafim is so important. Right, there are lots of things that we sort of have let go of that are mitzvot of the land of Israel, especially outside the land, right? No one suggests, for example, that we let the land rest in Ann Arbor and practice Shemitah here. But in the diaspora, we've kept on to this idea of Shmittat Kessafim. And so Rav Hirsch Rav Kook talks about how the Shemitah year serves to rectify the social ills and inequalities that can accumulate in society over the years. When poorer segments of society borrow from the wealthy, they feel beholden to the affluent elite. Right, the debtor is a servant of the lender, right, which is certainly true, right? We say that like you fall into this pattern where you have to keep borrowing to pay back the loans that you've had before, right? And so the sabbatical year comes to correct the situation of inequality and societal rifts by removing a major source of power of the elites, debts owed to them. However, the Torah stresses that a healthy and successful society is not achieved via annulment of private assets and redistribution of wealth. It is only the extreme cases of inequality and social injustice that the Torah seeks to remedy by remitting private debts, a partial repair of social inequities once every 7 years. Right. And so I think what Rav Kook is saying on some level is there are lots of ways we could have removed these inequalities in a better way. But this is sort of the way that doesn't totally, right? It's not like a communist society, but at the same time, there is like a remedy, right? We never let anyone dig themselves too deep into the hole. I'm not sure I understand your question, Mark. How anyone would think that the system was not flawed?
Right. I just don't understand how, even if you go by the simple biblical commandment, I mean, of course, it seems obvious that nobody's going to loan anybody money if it's going to be forgiven, especially as you get closer to the 7th year.
I see. Right. So I actually think like the smarter idea would have been to say 7 years from your loan, if you haven't been able to repay it, we release your debt then, Shmittat Kessafim. So it's not a 7-year cycle, it's like a personal loan cycle. Right, because like if we think about Rav Kook and the rectifying the social ills of sort of digging yourself into a debt hole, then 7 years feels like maybe that's a nice amount of time to repay the debt. And if for whatever reason you're not able to do it in that amount of time, then you can be forgiven then, as opposed to, right, creating a system where no one will lend anyone in that 6th year. It's true.
Or even that assumes that the person who borrows the money is acting in good faith.
That's a great point. This is certainly written, the shir is certainly written from the perspective that all of the borrowers are certainly trying to pay back the loan. And I guess I would say that I think that's the Torah perspective too. We're not assuming like a defaulted loan because of, greed or mismanagement of money or any of those things. We're assuming that the person truly can't pay it back. And so I do want to look at payday loans for 1 second. So, but how could we skip Rabbi Sachs? Because I think that Rabbi Sachs is also trying to, well, maybe we will skip Rabbi Sachs for right now. Because I think that we can apply a lot of our information to these facts. So this is like a very quick Google search. Payday loans have been evolving. I first heard this year, which I've modified very, very slightly, from Rabbi Ari Hart, who was working on a campaign to end payday loans in like 2017, maybe, so quite a bit ago. But I looked up some new facts. Payday loans are loans that are given that are have an extraordinarily high interest rate. 396% is the average APR for a payday loan, right? So if we say like a bad credit card rate is probably like, I don't know, in the 30s maybe, right? 30% seems like a terrible rate. 396% is for a payday loan. And the reason that people take out payday loans is because they have their budgets worked out to the penny, right? How to pay rent and eat food and clothe their kids and themselves and get their bus pass to go to work. But then someone gets sick or someone dies, or they need to take a plane ride to visit an ailing parent, or whatever the thing is, it sort of throws their entire system completely out of whack, right? And so that they have to go to a payday lender and they have to take out this money because they don't have any kind of credit for which to take out a new credit card. They don't own a home to take out a home equity line, right? This is really their only option available. And so that's why they can charge 396%, because they have you really in a hard spot. And it's fascinating to me, right, that there are more payday loan storefronts in 2017 than McDonald's locations, right? It's like a thriving business that thrives on the back of people who can't afford any other option when they get in trouble. And the average payday loan is $375. So we're not talking about really high stakes loans. But on average, you end up paying $520 in fees, not even just total. You borrow $375, you pay back $520. You have to pay back both, right? The fees are crushing. And that makes it so that on average, right, where did it go? 1 in 4 payday loans are rolled over or reborrowed 9 times or more, right? Meaning you can't afford the $520 on the original $375, which creates the system where you have to continue being in debt. The typical payday borrower is in debt 5 months out of every year. So almost 50% of their lives, they're working to pay back their payday loans. So this has been determined to be a very discriminatory and unfair system. And 17 states and the District of Columbia have banned payday lending, or they've set interest rate caps. So like in New York, they put the cap at 25%. It's not great, but it's not 396%. I looked it up last night. Michigan has no cap, and it is permitted to have payday loans. I think like in ultimate case of insult to injury, they recommend that you not get a payday loan because they're not very good, without acknowledging that these people have no other choice. People who go to payday lenders are not looking, are not able to look for a better offer. So and here are my sources in case anyone was worried that I made all these things up. So I think, right, to Mark's point, like, you have to have a system. No system is going to be perfect. All systems have their faults. But I think that there are ways to make it better, right? To set interest rate caps. That's like one way of saying, that's in my mind is like a little bit like saying a fixed debt point or the principal or right? To say like, we need to do this. Great, perfect, Mark. That is my segue to like, what can you do about this, right? So what? Interesting, Shir Yael, Shmittat Kessafim, something we didn't really know about maybe, or we don't think about. Maybe it applies today, maybe not, right? Like I've been a little wishy-washy. But I think that what Mark is saying, and he's talking about the prevalence of community free loan associations, is the way that we can remedy the system, not by practicing Shmittat Kessafim, but by creating a system where there is no interest. Because interest is really the crushing piece of these loans. So the Hebrew Free Loan Society exists in many states. There's one in Detroit that started in the 1980s. In the one in New York gives out about $14 million in loans every year to people and small businesses. And it's basically it's an interest-free loan. So you borrow the money, there's some set amount of time to give it back. There is no debt release in that sense, but there's no cycle of debt because you no longer have to pay $520 in fees to borrow $375. Another great system, which I think I've mentioned before, but maybe I can pull up the website, is called Kiva. I'm pretty sure it's kiva.org. I'm gonna put that here and see if that works. Kiva is also an interest-free loan society. It works mostly for people in the developing world. Will and I invested early in our marriage. You put in whatever you want. I think we put in $50. We were especially young and poor at that moment. And you get to pick, or the system will randomly assign you someone who needs that $50. And they have some set amount of time to give it back. And then you get a little notice. It's about once a year. I'd say we've probably invested it 10 times. Someone has paid back your loan. Would you like to remove your money from the system or reloan it to someone new? And so it's just an opportunity for someone who needs like what I would call a hand up instead of a hand out to get ahead. In a way that stops putting the person into a cycle of debt that feels unmanageable. So in an ideal world, I think the Shmittat Kessafim is a wonderful practice, but most of us are not really in the world of loaning out money. in general, I would imagine, like outside of our, our families or whoever we know that sort of might need help at some given point in their lives. And so it might not even really apply to us. And if it does, I think everyone is in like perfectly good standing to apply the PRIS bill so that they don't have to release that debt. But I think that maybe the better place to put emphasis today is on interest. And that by giving to the Hebrew Free Loan Society or giving through Kiva, where you sort of get to keep giving your money, it's a way to honor the system of saying that debt can be this crushing thing that is unescapable and allows you to loan with dignity and to help people, through that. What was the quote that I put at the beginning from Mishle, that to lend to people who need it, to poor people, and ultimately lend to God and create this sort of holy and spiritual partnership between us and between God. Welcome thoughts, comments, ideas. It was a lot of information. I'm happy to reshare the spreadsheet, the short sheet as well. Oh, another great question from Mark. Mark is saying that perhaps we don't need to be so limiting in our interpretation of Rei Ehu as to be only limited to Jews. It's a great point. My understanding of all of the laws around lending are that no one would lend money if there was no interest. And no one would lend money if there was no sort of mechanism for debt collection. And so to be able to be a good community lender within your Jewish nuclear community, you had to be able to do those things outside of the Jewish community. But certainly it has spurred huge amounts of anti-Semitism, right, over the centuries. And so, and today, I think, especially as a lot of those barriers for good and for bad have come down between Jews and non-Jews, it feels uncomfortable, I would agree, to say that this should only be applied to Rei Ehu as Jews. But certainly traditionally, that would be how we would read it.
I was going to say, I sort of had two thoughts. I guess one connection I drew, which I think is sort of interesting, is kind of the parallels between the Shemitah year debt redemption and also the US bankruptcy system. Because for us, we do sort of a weird opposite thing where you can declare bankruptcy and have all your debts voided, and then you have sort of a mark of shame put on your credit card statement for 7 years. Your credit score, I think, has a little note being like, but we say that mark of shame lasts for 7 years and then it's removed and you get a clean slate, or something like how your credit score cycles every 7 years. Which is kind of weird, that, interesting. The other thing I was going to note on the subject of payday loans, I think one thing I was struck by is also the sort of biblical command to pay your worker at the end of the day, which I know has been interpreted with a lot of nuance, but I know that's another policy that like workers' rights people have really advocated for, because in effect, when we don't pay our workers at the end of every day, they're giving their employer a month-long loan, essentially, which, when you look at who has the power, maybe another sort of interesting idea.
Yeah, I love that. That has always been for me like a very important thing. There was one time I forgot to bring the money for my nanny and I made her wait while I ran to the bank, which maybe was less nice because she seemed happy to wait till Monday. I said, no, I have to pay you today. You pay by the week. I must pay you today. But yes, I think you're right? We effectively force low income people to loan their employers money in that way. I think that's a great point. And what was I going to say about that? I do think, I was reading that there's been a rise in you can get your paycheck 2 days early in some banks. It's sort of a free service. Now, again, you have to have enough money to put in the bank. You have to have enough money to leave some money in the bank when you take out money at the end of the month. But that is sort of like a potential solution, which has sprung up, which is interesting. And to your point about bankruptcy, that's fascinating that it's a 7-year mark. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, or I think it's 7 years also for anything on your credit score. If you have some bad thing, you get it cycles every 7 years. I think is the time. Maybe it's 5, but sort of a similar idea. But I think a maybe less nice way of applying that concept. But
right, because I think if you declare bankruptcy, you can't take out credit cards at all.
Yeah, I think perhaps for this out until it's cleared. I think something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the larger point is there are lots of ways to address the debt cycle, and bankruptcy might be a loophole, but it doesn't feel like in the spirit of Shmittat Kessafim in the same way.
When we lived in Israel, everybody had an agreement with their bank that you could take money out against your next paycheck.
It's fascinating.
And the same thing with payday loans. Most of it, it's not even that people have emergencies, just that it's a cash flow problem.
Yeah, it's a great
You're
point.
going to get the money in a couple of weeks, but you need it now.
Yeah,
And businesses do that constantly.
right. Right.
It's just
Right.
that people that are too poor to participate in the banking system
Yeah.
are just really in bad shape, and that's
Yeah.
taken advantage of.
I've seen a lot of credit unions in this community, which is great because, right, that is another option in the banking world. Mark, I think your point is a great one, that even credit card interest rates are usually, I don't know how to pronounce that fancy word, usurious. But, and I think even more to your point, right, credit card rates are variable. And if you have good credit, they're very, very low. And if you have bad credit, they're very, very high, and you don't get any of the perks of miles or points or whatever. And so it does really perpetuate the cycle of debt because you have to pay more if you have less. So it's a great point. It's just that they're sort of within the range of normal. They're 10 times what your mortgage rate might be, as opposed to 100 times what your mortgage rate might be. And so I think that's a piece of it. Amazing.
I was just going to add, the other thing that's been in the news lately, of course, is that African Americans don't have the collateral, don't have the, they don't have, there's low rates of home ownership against which to borrow. And that has also skewed the system against the less fortunate.
Right. Right. I mean, there's so many tricky pieces to this financial puzzle. I recently saw a meme that said, like, this house cost $150,000 in 1960, and the minimum wage was $7.85. And today the minimum wage was $7.85, but that house costs $650,000, right? And so there are so many tricky pieces about inflation and not raising the minimum wage, and and the mortgage crisis of a few years back, right? I mean, this is not my area of expertise, but yes, it seems that there should be more ways to make things, to level the playing field enough that everyone has the opportunity for good debt instead of bad debt, and for debt release when it's not working. So I encourage everyone to make a gift to their Free Loan Society or to Kifa. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Next week, we'll go back to the Parsha on Wednesday.
Thank you. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day. Stay warm and safe. Drive safe, Monica.
Thank you, Yael.
Thank you.